Okay, welcome to Mehta-Ethics. This discussion's going to be a little bit meta, if I do say so, because we're basically talking about um, filming podcasts and everything goes into it. So for a bit of context, we are about to film the episode talking about Homo Deus, the Unabomber Manifesto, etc. But well, I'm kind of in this dilemma because I want these. Essentially, the impetus for starting these podcasts was me and Adrian occasionally just sit down and have a really interesting conversation. And I'm thinking, wow, like this would be great podcast material. But as soon as the camera's on, the audio's recording, suddenly, and I even notice I'm doing it right now, the behaviors change, Yeah.
Performative hand gestures.
Yeah.
I was thinking I don't want to construe this as a bad thing necessarily, but just to make the analysis in a neutral sense, is that not the equivalent of the Instagram model Instagram, someone who makes their living off Instagram, be it whatever, just like photography, they're always looking for content. So they're seeing the world in terms of content.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you're hearing conversations. I mean, I've certainly done this as well. Probably a lot of people do this. Since that format exists, it's like you have a very good conversation. You're like, oh, this is great content. And it's like, for whom? And it would be the same thing as when you're taking a video of a concert as it's happening. It's maybe a way of it's different now that we're actually doing it, but maybe it's a way sometimes of not engaging with what's in front of you because you're thinking about the idea that it's preserved, which is inherently untrue for any activity. Like when you preserve the concert, right? You can't literally relive that moment. It's going, it's rushing past your eyes as you're experiencing it, and you're never going to get to revisit it. But so it gives you some belief that you can return to that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. You've sort of reminded me. So the other week, I almost feel embarrassed to admit this, but the other week we had a really interesting chat about incels, and part of me almost felt like it was a waste because oh yeah, that would be really great podcast material, but it's not as if we can just redo that conversation. So yeah, that is a really good point. And yeah, at concerts, you almost want to yell, oh, put down all the phones and all that. It sort of really bothers me when something's already being recorded. Like if you're in an event and there's a photographer, part of me is like, okay, great, we can get off our phones. But also people still are on their phones.
Yeah, the true analogy would be if we were having a conversation and you just whipped out your phone and started recording. I don't want to lose this, And yeah, I mean, it is nice and it's great to have photographs. I think that photographs are more comparable to, okay, it's tricky because I want to kind of make this point about art, but I wouldn't say that's untrue of kind of podcasts and even some, filming an event in your life. But that has a more of an autobiographical thing. I feel like art is you're trying to reify or create a permanent version of something that is inherently ephemeral. So it's a feeling or something when you hear this isn't true. Some artists are more sort of technically inclined, but when you hear something that's very emotionally potent, what the artist was trying to do is generally, it's hard to say, right? Because you kind of buy into the narrative of the artist, and sometimes you project too much, and you think, wow, they must be such a eccentric person or something like that, or they have this intensity of feeling that I just as a subject lack. But it's there's certainly songs I Can't Live Without My Mother's Love by Mark Kozelek. I know that was written after he was on a phone call to his mum. So he was feeling those genuine emotions. And then through the process of art, he made a sort of symbolic, abstract version of that in order to kind of maybe not preserve that for himself. It's hard to say what his motivations are there, but it's kind of this it's kind of like a time capsule in a way.
Yeah.
But he's not trying to literally. The problem is that you can't record your feelings anyway, so it's so abstract that maybe art is just the best tool.
I feel like somewhat related to that Mark Kozlak story was like when people take drugs and then write music on them or about
Yes,
them.
yes.
Like psychedelic rock, you know. It's yeah, they kind of like take that experience and then preserve it in a sense.
Yeah, I just watched. I've read about half of the book. This book called Naked Lunch by a name I'm currently blanking on. We'll come back to that. But Naked Lunch is it's this guy who was part of the Beat. So you have Jack Kerouac who did like The Road. I don't know if you're familiar with any of these books. I'd highly recommend them. Yeah, I'll have to. I don't have a copy, but you should definitely read it sometime.
And there's a Jawbreaker song where they mentioned Kerouac.
Oh fuck yeah. But sorry, the point I wanted to make there was it was just these drug experiences like geez, I really wish I could remember his name, but this always, you feel the pressure of needing to remember the name.
That's another example of like things that come up in this podcast thing. Like if you and I are just talking, you can just be like, oh, I read something the other day, whereas, and I mean, part of it's like there's a legit reason to. Like I don't want to just like spout pseudoscience and then just have 0 sources in the description or something like that. I think also. Like another issue with when we start filming the podcast is like, and to be honest, I have this if I'm just going to a party or something, is like the only reason I wore this watch today is because I knew we were going to film a podcast. Or like I got to brush my hair or, like shave or things before the podcast. I do that before parties too. And it's like, maybe that's just a flaw with myself. Like, I sometimes if I go to a party, I think, how many people shaved? Obviously, I'm not shaving at the moment, but how many people shaved just for this party? And I don't know if this is true, but I assume that like I'm the only one, or like maybe 1 or 2 other people, and then the rest of the people don't really like care as much as me or put that much effort in. And then I'm thinking, oh, that's another flaw of mine and all that,
I feel like you needn't worry about it either way, but my sense is that that's untrue. Maybe I'm also a vain person, but I think that's kind of part of the ritual of enjoying going to a party. It's like, you're dressed up. It's an occasion like no other. So the clothes form part of the ritual in the same way when you go to like a funeral, there's a certain attire that's, and it communicates some kind of mood in the same way, like, because it has a visceral kind of psychological effect upon yourself. Like I've noticed this very much with, certain psychedelic drug experiences, which we won't go into, but...
if you want me to cut that out of this, I will.
I don't really have a problem with it. Let's just go for it. We'll see. Where, like, it seems really basic, but like I would put on a coat that had all these kind of memories associated with it, and like I felt was like kind of fly, and like it immediately changed my perception of myself. It was like, what the fuck? All I did was put on this coat, and I feel like there's something embodied in this coat that just became like bestowed upon me. It was like the commodity fetish, like become manifest, but like
well, I mean, fuck it. Since we've taken it there, then I've noticed in trips like sort of hyper aware of like everyone's style and what they're wearing, what their hair's like, like how much muscle they have or like how skinny someone is. And not really in like a sort of hierarchy is completely absent. It's not as if like, oh, this guy's a Chad, he's got so much muscle. It's like, this guy is perceived as a Chad, he's got so much muscle.
Right.
Or like, I immediately associate like this person with this kind of archetype. It's kind of interesting.
I think, like, I think, personally, I think that I need to sort of, look into it. So this is kind of a very bold statement, but I think that psychedelics are kind of good proof of some certain psychoanalytic concepts. I mean, you just brought up Archetypes, which is Jungian, right?
I don't know if you could say proofs, but you could definitely say that they become obvious on it.
Like, I think the idea of the unconscious is you get access to a part of that in a psychedelic experience.
Because you, for example, like coat, you didn't notice everything that you associate with it until you're in this headspace.
Yeah, it's a deeper experience of what you're already having. It's not that, I mean, this is the problem with understanding the psychedelic experience as purely just like a drug experience. And that might be good if you want to dissociate certain things, maybe if you have a bad trip. But even so, there could be genuine triggers underlying that bad trip, things that you haven't addressed. And so to say it was purely, generally speaking, not in all cases, but to say it was purely a drug experience and I cannot extract anything of value from that kind of thing. And so, yeah, in terms of, I think when you were noticing that situation, in my opinion, that's like access to the unconscious, and it's something that's present in all these ordinary situations, but your brain is kind of taking care of it under the surface. It's kind of like, and here's where I think there's a bit of divergence. You know how there's, I think it's like cognitive psychology. They also have an idea of the unconscious. So they say like, but they've adapted it. They've say like, it's basically just information processing that is kind of subconscious and you aren't exactly aware of. So all these things about repressed desires, they're not really as interested in or convinced of. But I think there's sort of an alignment here where something like that, which is both, it's kind of, I mean, on the one hand it's an act of like deconstruction, because you were, like you said, that dude wasn't a Chad. It was like we have certain imagined hierarchies that give precedence to people who dress a certain way, and there's these archetypes we associate with them. So it's a much more like deconstructed way of looking at things, rather than even the objectivity of the so-called hierarchy was broken down for you in that moment, at least as it pertained to like this guy's muscle mass and style or whatever.
I've had people like talk to me and just like it doesn't offend me, but just no prompt, no, I haven't asked for it at all. They'll just like outright say, I associate you with this archetype, and it's very weird. So for the record, I would definitely not consider myself a stoner, but I was at the pub with some people and like the topic of weed came up, and one guy who I didn't know that well, and he's a really lovely guy, like I'm mates with him, so I don't mean to put him down by saying this, but he like looks at me and he says, oh bro, like I don't even know you and I can tell you smoke weed. And like I guess there's the long hair and like maybe some other mannerisms in like the way I speak or like where I grew up in high school, but it's just like very strange. Or like, I mean this is true, like, but like people will say, oh, people might think I like metal, and I do like metal. It's like not my favorite genre.
I wouldn't call you like a metal head. You know what I mean? Yeah.
But people might associate me with that archetype, or like being a vegan, or like,
Absolutely.
I feel like when, I don't know, have you watched many like YouTubers that talk about psychedelics or anything like that? Because I noticed like kind of conversing with your subconscious is like that's can kind of be like a common theme, but it's also kind of just impossible to describe without having experienced. And I feel like as soon as I drop that line, then it's like, oh, now I'm encouraging people to take psychedelics, and also like as much as certain YouTubers say that like their videos are purely for harm reduction and they're not trying to endorse it, I also feel like they're definitely not trying to endorse it, but certain people are gonna now be interested in it that would never have done it. Which it's hard to say how harmful it is, but I feel like it in situations can be harmful.
Okay, I'm going to perhaps implicitly promote it, but speak in as objective terms as I can. So if you take this as a promotion, that's purely your own, in terms of, in relation to your own values and interests. But, I would see psychedelics as a kind of tool, right? So if you're looking under a microscope or binoculars or something like that, it's going to alter your sensory equipment that we have. We have a certain, apparatus that we use to interpret phenomena in the world, which don't present to us as, we know based on the different abilities of other beings, in terms of their sensory, apparatus, that they experience the world differently to us. So it says something about the world itself. It's we're not perceiving the objective world. Do you know what I mean? We just have basically, because of evolution, we have like a set of tools that's like basically good enough. It's basically going to do the job in terms of, understanding the information around us. But it doesn't need all the data that's out there or the most accurate picture of the world. It's the most accurate picture of the world insofar as it promotes our survival, kind of thing. So in the same way, when you take a psychedelic, it alters your sensory perception. It's kind of a tool for thought and for perception. And, you don't have to use that tool. Like, you don't have to use a microscope, to understand a lot of things. But if you want to have that personal, you can understand it from someone else's perspective if someone explains it to you. But if you want to have that personal understanding, that Gnostic knowledge, from your own perspective, then that's what it's a tool for.
Maybe this...
You can cut that out if you want.
Maybe this analogy doesn't really fit, but like I have a microscope that's like, I don't know, it's like 100 times amplification or something. It's about this big and you just put it up to your eye. But I've noticed it's interesting, like you go over your fingertips or like on a leaf and you kind of notice all these things, and then when you take the microscope away, you can still see them, but you couldn't see them before.
Oh, that's really interesting. Wow.
Yeah. One time I was talking to a
That's
friend.
a perfect analogy.
Yeah. If it's true.
Please go on.
One time a friend of mine and I were talking about a particular psychedelic experience I had. And this friend's never taken psychedelics. I think he's only drunk. But I was actually talking about a really terrifying experience I had and how it was really unpleasant and that I'm gonna take a break. So I like haven't tripped since then, and it was over a year ago. Yeah, a long time ago. But I did mention like some things I was feeling and some things I was thinking and some things I saw in great detail, but still like the overarching theme of the conversation was the negatives. It was like, this was terrifying, this was awful. Like maybe just to give some idea, like at the end of the trip, I thought that I would be like permanently damaged. I thought I was gonna have PTSD. I was extremely surprised about two positive things. One, that I was able to sleep very easily, which is very uncommon for me in general, but especially under the influence. And two, I felt completely fine the next day. So fine that it was really unnerving. But generally the trip was awful. Although now I want to say, like, I noticed a couple, like coming out of that, I noticed a couple things of like, why certain things went wrong, and I actually do feel like I learned a bit about myself from that. But still, sorry, not to digress. So I was in this conversation with this guy, and I was saying this was awful. It was the worst experience ever. But just talking about that, he said that now he's kind of interested in it, whereas before he'd never really been interested in doing it, aside from like maybe a couple moments. Whereas like he still hasn't done it. And this conversation was months and months and months ago. But yeah, that's sort of an example of how hard it is to talk about this without wanting to promote it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's important not to take things too literally. In the same way, I would make an analogy to like dream analysis, which is not something I've gone super deep into, but I think there's some kind of meaning, latent meaning in dreams. I don't think so. The cognitive psychology approach here would be like, it's just meaningless. It's just your brain. It's just kind of random stimuli from throughout your day or that you happen to remember or whatever, and it kind of just got all thrown together, and there's no intrinsic meaning there. Like, this isn't even a scientific claim, but from personal experience, I think that's completely wrong. Because there's stuff that's just clearly kind of laced with meaning, but there's sort of layers to the interpretation. You don't just go like, you do have those dreams where it's some kind of very obvious wish fulfillment, like you're in a relationship with someone or something like that, and you can take that very literally. But what I've heard said is like the most obvious dreams are kind of the least valuable in terms of the analysis. It's the more obscure, the more opaque dreams where you kind of have to, you're not taking the information literally, but you're finding some kind of symbolic interpretation of that is of some meaning, exposes something about like what your fears are, what your desires are. So something like fears, could also manifest in the form of like a bad trip. And so you would experience like, heightened versions of your deepest fears or something like that. And you don't have to sort of take that experience literally of like X is going to happen, or, but you can be aware of like what it is that you're kind of worried about or something like that.
With dreams, do you mean like your subconscious is semi-consciously showing you that, or do you mean just things that are in your subconscious come up and you can consciously, sort of like meditation, you can consciously be aware of what you're feeling?
Yes, but it's only after the fact. And that's the analogy I'm trying to draw with tripping. It's like you say about how you thought, you were not you're gonna have PTSD or something. You shouldn't make decisions, like big life decisions, like immediately, like in the come down of the trip, right? Everyone knows from experience that that's a mistake. You come to feel about things differently, and that's because you need the act, and then you need the interpretation of that act. The two cannot coexist simultaneously. It's something like another analogy that I would give with that is something like some kind of political act, like a revolution or something like that. We leftists are very into like our theory, and we have this like theory praxis. It's kind of a dichotomy at times, but I think the truth of that dichotomy is that the two cannot occur simultaneously. You need to have, the act. The revolution is not the time for theorizing, you know what I mean? Except insofar, like maybe like propagandizing, like, stuff that's kind of current, but some, abstract general theory of like history or whatever, like that can only come after, because it's only in retrospect that you can really make sense of what was kind of going on.
Yeah. Have you ever like tried to lucid dream or had lucid dreams?
I've lucid dreamed once. Yeah, I don't know what the sort of theoretical. I'm thinking about psychoanalysis, and I'm thinking, if you introduce agency into it, does that mean that less is kind of revealed? Because you're acting upon the world, so you're manifesting what you want, but that's too direct, right? That's kind of too obvious. Like Freud thinks you can't really access the unconscious directly, and that's why it has to be through this kind of symbolism. It's not the phallus, it's like a fucking cucumber or something like that. Terrible example, but...
Maybe it's a spectrum, because... So I've gone through periods of like heavily trying to lucid dream, and I've also had at least a couple lucid dream experiences that just happened by themselves. But definitely I've been in dreams where I've lucid dreams. So it's like if you kind of become too conscious, then you come out of the dream. Maybe some lucid dreamer pro is gonna like watch this and like be, laughing at this. But some people, I think it's a sort of a skill. Like once you become aware that you're dreaming, you have to stay in the dream, because then otherwise you wake up. And potentially what that is like staying on a certain level of unconsciousness. Because maybe on the other spectrum, I think I've definitely realized I was dreaming, but then either not realized I can do this or just not done anything. Like, even though I'm aware I'm dreaming, haven't tried to influence the dream.
Right, it's a stage of kind of self-awareness.
Yeah.
But if you think about it in terms of like brain states, in terms of different parts of your brain, like by definition, when you're dreaming, there's a certain part, I'm going to say it's probably like the frontal lobe or something like that, that kind of logical, top-down kind of ordered thinking. It's less sensory. It's about interpretation and kind of fitting things into categories. Like, by definition, that part of your brain has to be kind of switched off for you to be in the dream state.
Yeah.
Because you've loosened your grip on reality to the point where you're allowing these experiences to kind of manifest. But so they can't coexist with this total top-down of like, imagine having some 10-step, like really specific plan of what you're going to do in the dream or something. Like, I'm going to, I don't know, like make a shit ton of money, and then I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and this whole like laundry list of things I've always wanted to do. Like that level of cognition by definition, I'm assuming, couldn't coexist with like the dream state.
Um, I think this is an example that anyone, like even someone that's never lucid dreamed, could maybe get. But you know, when you, and I think I've like sort of maybe even practiced enough to do this when I'm going into sleep. You know, when you wake up in the morning and you're like fully conscious, you're listening to things, but you're also in a dream, so half dreaming. Have you had that?
I know when it's the opposite, when you're falling asleep, it's called hypnagogic consciousness, but I'm not sure if it's the same thing.
Oh,
In
well,
reverse, yeah.
maybe it's not so universal, but like often I'll wake up and like you still kind of remember what you're dreaming and you want to continue the dream and you can kind of put yourself back in the dream. I feel like that's somewhere on this spectrum
Yeah.
of lucid dreaming. And yeah, like in that state, you can sort of control your dreams. I guess the main theme of like this part of the conversation is like once we're controlling the dreams, like how accurate are interpretations, or like how meaningful is anything we can grasp from it. And also when going into dreams, like have you ever just like sat there with your eyes closed and like you notice you kind of like you see sort of like shapes or like weird colors, things. I'm not talking about like pressing on your eyeballs. And if you kind of just sit there long enough, you can start to manipulate them in your head.
That sounds awesome. I've never experienced that. That's really fascinating.
I remember doing this in like library class in like year 5 or 6, and I don't think it's anything close to a superpower. I literally think anyone can do it without practice. Maybe give it a try sometime.
It could be something like visualization. Everyone has some capacity to do it, but you know, sometimes this is invoked in meditation, like trying to show the nature of, you know, the like your sensory apparatus and how it doesn't fully interact with reality, etc., etc. You know, you invoke something like a image of a candle, for example, and it's like, you know, all I can say about someone else doing that, because I don't have their subjective experience, is that they'll see something, but the definition of that and the texture and the detail I can't speak to, and I think that's different for different people.
One time, I don't really know why this particular time is memorable, but I was going to bed and I notice often when I'm in bed, like I kind of see a grid, like it's very faint, but if I block out all light, I can sort of make that out. And so maybe this kind of just serves as an example, but I was in bed, I was going to sleep, and I was consciously trying to sort of like visualize, and this can kind of be like a way to lucid dream in lucid dreaming videos I've watched, where you're in bed falling asleep and you start to visualize, and then you slowly start to see it more and more, and then supposedly soon enough you're in a dream and you're lucid dreaming, which hasn't actually happened to me, but I could imagine it. But it was like, so you know the Matrix, where it like shows you that scene of like all the like these massive towers of people being bred. That's like what I started to see. I was like traveling through this like scene of like they weren't actually like people, but it was just kind of visually it looked like that.
See, we instinctively thought of the same thing in a sense, because when you're talking about the grid, it made me think of like maybe this image is from like honestly like Rick and Morty or something, but like in terms of the grid, it's like the base level of the simulation. I wish I could like implant this visual image in your head, because you'd get it instantly, but unfortunately I have to mediate through language, god damn it. But imagine like a hemisphere, and it's a grid and it's kind of green. That's like sort of the base. If you have like a computer simulation or something, it's kind of outlining the shape of the simulation, and then you like, you know, put in the detail or whatever. So I immediately thought simulation theory. It's like you're seeing through the simulation.
Yeah, my I've used the subconscious, and then I've accessed like the world outside.
There's I just want to shout out my boy Tim Hecker, who I don't know obviously, but he's a musician.
Your best mate
who makes like ambient music kind of, and he has an album called Virgins, and it's and also his other album Rave Death. Like those are the only albums that have made me feel like there's a particular point at which like I felt like I was literally about to wake up from the simulation. It was so just like I don't know, powerful.
I'll check it out. Maybe we can talk about like alternative forms of podcasting, because we always come with this issue where like we're talking with about a book, and then it's like, it's really constricted. Like potentially it could be better to just every month or every 2 months we just do a podcast and we just talk about a bunch of stuff. We can have like maybe some sort of implicit expectation that we'll read similar books, and like, that way we can kind of like have more guests. So for example, like the antinatalism podcast, there were
the guests who will not be named.
Yeah, there were
for legal reasons.
There was more than just us two. It's great having podcasts with just us two, but like, for like interest's sake or different.
Oh, absolutely,
sake,
absolutely.
It can be good to have like multiple people.
I think I agree. I think just when you're with friends, especially like it kind of has to be close friends in a way, but I would say these little like synchronicities kind of occur where like, we elected to read Homo Deus and we said like this is the book we're going to read, but thematically those ideas are present in a lot of different places. This isn't in the book, but something like simulation theory is just very kind of mainstreamed now, and I'm very often see my path of thinking as defined by broader forces that have kind of pushed me in certain directions, veganism and leftism. It's not because I'm this super smart, truth-seeking, enlightenment individual. It's because of these broader social forces that have kind of mainstreamed these ideas. And then I happen to be born into certain circumstances that kind of align to push me in that direction. It's kind of deterministic, but I kind of like it in a way because it takes away the individual as the agent of change, in history.
Okay, well, like and subscribe. Maybe the future podcast formats, if you're a subscriber, maybe you'll notice them to change slightly, but hopefully for the better.